Hello, everybody, and a very, very warm welcome to this webinar, which Early Excellence is doing in partnership with BSME. I'm delighted you're able to join us. It's a really short webinar, about 30 minutes, focusing in on strengthening adult interactions. For those of you who are new to Early Excellence, a very, very warm welcome to you. And I'll share some information at the end of this short webinar where you can access some free resources from us that can help support you with developing your practice and provision. My name's Phil Armstrong. I'm part of the curriculum and strategic team at Early Excellence. I've been part of the team now for 8.5 years, and I'm really lucky that part of my role is supporting international schools. And it's been a real privilege working with lots of members of BSME over the last year or so, and we were there at the conference in May this year, hoping to be again there next year as well. It was fantastic meeting so many of you. If after watching this short webinar you've got any questions or would like to know any more information, I'll make sure you've got my email address as well. And as always, if there's anything else we can do to support you and your teams, please do let us know. Like I said, this is quite a short webinar, lots of kind of bits of information. Some things I'll go through fairly quickly, perhaps reflect on later on with the teams. Other things I shall go through in some greater depth. As I said, in terms of finding about Early Excellence, the best place to have a look is actually on our website, where you'll find lots of information about the services we offer for international schools. If you can't find that information, do please drop me a line. So whenever we start any of our training sessions, there are kind of three core areas that we tend to focus on and kind of thread all the way through the presentations that we share. And it's kind of these three cornerstones of really effective early childhood education. First of all, thinking about that unique child and what we know about child development, the interests of young children, and also thinking about the specific interests that sometimes individual children will have as well. Of course, one of the things that perhaps we've been exploring more over the last year or so is also those needs of children who may have more complex or additional needs and how we can support them. And that's actually something Early Excellence we're working very hard on at the moment to try and develop some tools to support you with that. So do keep an eye out for those. We also talk about the environment, and sometimes we talk about the environment as being the third teacher or the third adult, perhaps that's working alongside our children. But to really unlock the potential of that learning environment takes really expert adults who are able to see the potential of all the resources and to be able to unleash that potential to really maximize the learning opportunities for our children. And of course, what I imagine many of you have been doing, if it's been your new kind of term over the last few weeks, is spending that great deal of time building those brilliant relationships with children. We're really privileged as a team in that we get to go and visit lots of different schools every week. And it's been fascinating joining schools this term, just seeing how those relationships are built. And also talking to colleagues about how different they feel perhaps the cohorts are than maybe a few years ago, and reflecting on perhaps the challenges some of those children have been through over the last 4 years or so, and also think about that wider community impact that the pandemic had as well. So I think we're in some really interesting times, but there's no doubt about it. If we as adults really develop and nurture our own expertise about how to work with young children, we can be the best possible partners in play and learning for those children. It's also been interesting talking to lots of schools over the last few months or so about how they're expanding their early years provision. In some cases, opening nursery for the first time. In some schools, it's having children who are 2 years old. And that's something that we've been working on to try and develop some tools and support you with, and particularly thinking about how to strengthen those adult interactions and developing that adult expertise. And I said, if you'd like to learn more, please do drop me a line after today. So some starting points really, and just kind of a reflection, and some of you who've done any training with us before might be familiar with these sort of questions, but I always think it's really good to revisit them regularly through the year. So can all the adults that are working with your children give a really rich learning tour of the classroom spaces, both inside and outside as well? Can they talk about the resources? Can they talk about what the resources are called, why they've been placed in the provision, and the connection those resources have to learning and to teaching? How are those resources being modelled to the children? How are they being gradually introduced over time? So you've been enriching that provision as well, in line with children's interests and needs, but also in line with your curriculum. And then also thinking about that progression and challenge for your provision. If you have got, say, 2-year-old children, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, and 5-year-olds, and so on, are we thinking about that progression journey as they move through experiencing the resources that you're providing inside and outdoors? Are we seeing some different opportunities for them? And then taking some time to evaluate which areas of provision are working particularly well. And something I've been suggesting to a lot of people to do over the last few weeks or so is to draw the classroom layout inside and outside, photocopy it lots of times and have it handy. So every now and again, you can mark off where children are engaging in child-initiated activity, working alongside other children, maybe working with adults or group activity. So you can start to see, is the whole of the environment working really hard for you? Or are there pockets where perhaps they're kind of cooler spots, I suppose, really? Also, are there any patterns that you might see? So are we seeing kind of gender patterns, or some children perhaps who are less confident in working some area of provision? And also part of that is to spot where are adults having interactions with children. We want the whole of our environment to be interaction rich. And I think sometimes as adults, we tend to have our favourite places, don't we? The places where we really like to go and engage in provision, perhaps where we feel most confident. Indeed, a few years ago, I was working with a nursery school here in the UK, and we also almost had a confession time where people talked about the places that they felt less confident, the places they would choose perhaps not to go and play alongside the children versus ones that they really love spending time in. And when we started to unpick that, often what lay at the heart of that was perhaps not as deep a knowledge about why we have those areas of provision. So like why we have a mud kitchen, why we have the role play, what the actual value is in terms of supporting children's learning. And once we help clarify that with colleagues who were more confident, talking to ones perhaps who were less confident or less experienced, suddenly they became more confident in stepping into those areas of provision. So that might be something you might want to think about. Also be thinking about a progression or enrichment across the year and linking that to our interactions as well. So there is a tendency sometimes for us to put a bit too much into our early years environments, lots and lots of resources. Again, those of you who've worked with early excellence before, be familiar with this kind of less is more strategy. And I think particularly so at this time of year, when children are still spending that time getting familiar with the environment, getting familiar with the adults, if it can feel quite overwhelming if we've got too many resources there. So maybe at this point, you might want to reevaluate and think, actually, I haven't taught how to use that resource yet. We haven't had a conversation as a team about why it's in that the provision, what the language is related to it. Maybe we'll take those resources out for the moment and then gradually add them back in. Indeed, one school that I was working with recently, they were exactly had that kind of journey. They felt they put too much in at the beginning. The children had a chance to explore and to use resources as part of their play. And now what they were doing is reevaluating, taking some things out and planning when to gradually introduce them back in as part of a really effective teaching, learning and interaction strategy for those children. So some things maybe to do a little bit after today, and everybody do that tour. And one of the things to kind of aim for is then to take other people on the tour. So other members of your school team, colleagues that are working with other age groups of children, senior leaders and so on. So you keep kind of talking the talk, actually knowing what is actually there and what is providing a really brilliant learning experience for your children. So yeah, something to do perhaps after today. So let's think particularly though about that adult role. And as I say, that kind of partners in play and partners in learning, which is what we're striving constantly to be for our children. In this short session, we're not going to explore too much about play, but play is so complex, it's so vital for young children. And of course, we can think about play in terms of continuum. So we have kind of free play for our children, but we also have playful learning. We have things that we devise which are playful in their nature. We have playing alongside our children as well. It really is kind of multifaceted and something definitely we know is crucial to young children's development. So we do need to know how to be a partner in play and crucially, therefore, to be a partner in learning as well. So we know that you can have the most amazing learning environment, but ultimately it's those adults that release the potential of it. In fact, at the moment here in the UK, we do some road shows where we take our interactive classroom around to schools and use it as part of a training package. And one of the courses we do is called actually Unlocking the Potential of Your Learning Environment, really releasing it. And so that adults understand why everything is there and how it's been carefully selected to support children learning, but also selected because it's things that children really like to do. And when we bring those two things together, we know we're going to have a really powerful and effective learning environment where children are really highly involved and great levels of well-being as well. So going back to that kind of triangle, this particular short session, we're going to focus in very much on that kind of green circle down the bottom there, going to be thinking about that adult role. And increasingly, as our early years teams start to expand, we may have colleagues who are less experienced in working with early years children. We may also have adults who've been working perhaps with older children and have chosen they want to work with early years. Now, that's fantastic. It's kind of like, let's embrace these new colleagues. But we need to make sure we're supporting our colleagues who are less experienced in developing and enriching their child development knowledge. For many of us, perhaps that was only touched on briefly as part of our training, our teacher training, or courses that we may have done. And it's so important that we revisit it and we try and go for greater depth of our own knowledge, just as we try to do with children as well. And of course, there are resources that can support with that, things like the original Develop Matters, for example, which very much help look at child development. That's what it was designed to support. Some of you may have used our previous kind of tools like EXAT, which certainly looked at child development as well. And if you'd like some more help around that, please do get in touch after today's session. Again, those of you who are familiar with some early excellent training in the past will be familiar with this triangle. And it's the kind of way we structure sort of curriculum thinking, I suppose, really. So we have our directed activities, which are much more adult and focused, enhanced, which are our temporary additions or temporary experiences within the learning environment, and then our continuous provision, those resources that are there all year for our children, that constant environment, which we gradually enrich alongside over the year. And what we've done here is overlay that, thinking about adults and the role of adults working within those different contexts. So, for example, when you're an adult working in directed activities, you're almost kind of leading the conversation. You've got some sense of the structure, what it is you really want the children to gain from that activity. And of course, that could be phonics, it could be mathematics, but it also could be learning how to use the scissors, learning how to use the paintbrush, things that are going to help those children when they're working independently within continuous provision. What's been interesting talking to lots of schools over the last few weeks is they've been doing a lot more directed activity about play. So how to use things like Mobilo, how to use Play-Doh, how to use the home corner. So really kind of leading those kind of experience for the children. So ultimately, when children are given agency, dependence to work in the environment, they've got some skills and understanding to be able to use and apply there. But that particular context, that direct activities from an adult perspective, it can seem almost more straightforward. It's a more traditional kind of teaching approach. Enhanced provision, similarly, as you add something into the environment, a temporary thing, maybe linked into a theme or children's interests, you've got a sense of what you want to achieve from doing that particular, making that particular decision. Similarly, taking a trip or bringing a visitor, you kind of have a plan. Now, of course, with both directed activities and enhanced provision, children being children, particularly young children, things can sometimes go off on a tangent. But nevertheless, you've kind of got a sense of what your adult role is, what the adult focus is within those two different contexts. The challenge, I think, for those who are less experienced in working with young children is when we move into continuous provision and that working alongside children. And then it's that sensitive interaction becomes absolutely critical. And sometimes that involves stepping back and listening. So we really do understand what children are demonstrating to us through really careful observation. Sometimes it involves using conversation, prompts and so on. Sometimes it's role modeling. It's a really complex recipe. And of course, this kind of recipe changes depending on the context, depending on the children we're working with, depending on which part of the environment it might be. You'll notice Sarah even talks about wondering out loud and kind of thinking about questions. Of course, that starts to then link into things like sustained shared thinking. Indeed, I wonder, as a phrase, somebody described as a linguistic lubricant. It kind of oils conversation, which I think is a lovely way of describing it. So what we need to do is make sure that our adults are working with children within a continuous provision or a free flow environment where children are making their own choices about what they would like to do, are really skillful in interpreting children's play and understanding what children are demonstrating, but also being able to skillfully support and scaffold play and to extend learning as appropriate. And that's going to rely on really great knowledge of that learning environment, what you want your children to learn, so your curriculum, and your knowledge of child development as well. When you bring all those things together, that's when you can have those really brilliant and interactions with the children. The sensitivity really is the key. Again, what I often suggest to people who are less experienced is to try and almost do some paired observation, working alongside a more experienced colleague, so they can almost narrate what they're seeing through their observation and kind of translating for you what it is actually that children are engaged in when they're in child-initiated activity. This is actually a quote from a project that Julie Fisher led a few years ago. If nothing after today, what I'd recommend, if you haven't got it already, is a fantastic book by Julie Fisher called Interacting or Interfering. And through the book, Julie talks about some really brilliant strategies to help strengthen adult knowledge and expertise about interaction. But I love this idea from Julie that really we should be asking ourselves, did we make a difference? Did we improve the experience for those children every time we have an interaction? Thinking, did that actually help? Did that move the learning forward? Or would it have been better for me to step back and to observe and then to think about what to do next, what would be more appropriate? As I said, sometimes it's actually better to step back, stay quiet for a moment and think about it. And that requires permission from almost from our leaders as well, doesn't it? Saying it's okay not to talk sometimes. Sometimes it's far better for us to listen and understand and try and interpret what the child is demonstrating, particularly on working with very young children. So to do all of this, of course, what's it requiring? And as I kind of hinted at there earlier on, it requires obviously the knowledge of that unique child. What are their needs? What are their interests? What's their situation? What's their context? What fascinates them? That knowledge of child development, absolutely critical. And keep revisiting our understanding of how young children's brains develop continues to grow and grow. Some really interesting resources out there at the moment. I would always say handle with care, because sometimes things that are presented as kind of research related to early years may not be as closely tied to young children as we would hope they were going to be. So handle with care. And knowledge of the curriculum, both your curriculum, of course, the child's curriculum, things that they're fascinated in, but thinking about how your curriculum, your kind of school's curriculum, links into that provision is absolutely critical. That's going to help you understand the potential of that provision. And that of putting this all together, of course, requires great expertise. And what's going to support that is regular conversations across your team. So wherever possible, we're always encouraging people to have regular team meetings, talking about individual children, but also talking about the provision. And one strategy to help support this is having regular meetings in different areas of provision, reflecting on how has it been going, how are we using these resources, what language is being strengthened, for example, what skills and expertise. For those of you with settings where you've got different age groups, so maybe you've got 2-year-olds and you've got a 3- and 4-year-old provision and 4- and 5-year-olds and so on, what we recommend is sometimes choose the same area in each area of provision. So maybe go to the block area in each of them, go together as almost like a team, as a phase, and to talk also as part of that conversation, talk about the progression that you see happening as well. So really strengthening knowledge of the whole team is absolutely crucial as part of this process. And of course, how do we need to be through all of our interactions? I often think we owe this lady in this photograph a great deal of money because we've used her photo many, many years now. But I do think it's a really powerful reminder of that magical moment that we all have when we're working alongside young children, and that immense privilege we have of working alongside young children, because we get to be there first. We're part of those first moments, those first times, aren't we? So I don't know if you can see in the photograph, but actually they're looking at some moss. And I suspect that the lady there, she's seen moss many times in her life before, but from her face, there was complete awe and wonder. And you can imagine the reaction and the kind of emotional response that generates it in the child there, and the connection she's feeling with the adult as part of a shared learning experience. I was telling some colleagues a few days ago on another session, actually, about a really magical moment I personally experienced a couple of weeks ago. I often talk about how the first time children hear a sea in a shell, all those kind of things. And I was there in a school this week when there was a child who'd never put a shell to their ear before. And suddenly they heard that sound, that whirring sound of the ocean, the sea, and the look of complete surprise on children's face. But what made it even more delightful was 3 of their friends who clearly had that experience before were delighted that now their friend was part of that same experience as well. It was a really kind of magical interaction moment that really made me smile for the rest of the day and continues to do so. So those relationships we know are absolutely critical. And of course, those are being nurtured and strengthened, particularly during these first few weeks and months of the year. But for some of our children, we need to constantly keep revisiting those relationships, don't we? Because children, how they are feeling about their relationships with us, but also feeling about relationships with adults in general, feeling about relationships with the wider world, with their friends and so on, can go up and down. We know that as life, different circumstances change. And of course, I imagine for many of you working within international schools, you'll have children arriving at different points of the year. So how do we help them re-establish new relationships? For those of us who've had children joining schools for the very first time, who may have been going to kindergarten, nursery for a number of years, suddenly leaving that environment is really difficult. Having to form a whole set of new relationships can really take time. So I think it's, again, really important after these first few weeks to sit down and reflect on how are those relationships going as part of wider conversations about interaction. Also, some of you may have done this with me before, but I would thoroughly recommend you do it. It's an activity linked into the Lumen Scales called the concept of care with. So after about sort of 6 weeks, so your children probably bring with you now for 6 weeks, 8 weeks or so, is to sit down and against the clock, write down all the names of the children that you work with. And you have to do it really quickly. And you can't be looking at class lists. It's all got to be from memory. Because often what we find is, say you've got a class of, say, 20, 25 children, a couple will be missed off that list. And the risk is, of course, if those children are missed off our kind of mental list, is actually our awareness of how they are in terms of their well-being, their relationships, and so on, may be diminished slightly. One of the advantages of being a part of an early years team is because you've perhaps got more adults there, the children have almost got more spotlights on them. So a child who may have been kind of in the shadows in your kind of memory may actually be in the bright light of somebody else. So it's important to do it as part of the team, but also to do it regularly. So every 8 weeks or so, just sit down, quickly write who all those children are and check in that nobody is being forgotten. Nobody's in the shadow. Yes, no one's on the wings of the stage. If anybody's watching this session who's in a senior leadership position who actually doesn't have a class of their own, what I would recommend you do is write down all the adults that you work with. Really interesting again to see who is and who occasionally may be missed off those lists, and a reminder about taking care of adults' well-being as well. Other things we need to be doing, of course, is really valuing the way children want to do things. This young man apparently is asked to clean everything in his own nursery school, and he asked for the materials and things that he wanted. And I believe when they unpicked it a little bit, what they discovered is actually the previous weekend he'd been helping his father to clean out, I think it was the garage at home, and washing things down and cleaning the car and so on. And he wanted to replicate, to role play that. But he was really brave in asking for the materials he wanted. But what was crucial was the staff really respected that and valued it. And from what I believe, he did an absolutely amazing job, which is fantastic. I'm sure he felt very proud of his achievements too. Going back to interacting or interfering, Julie talks about being able to tune in. And I think that's a really skillful process. It requires sometimes real concentration and real focus. And therefore, kind of stopping and pausing is so important, isn't it? And that listening in, what are they really saying? Sometimes I think it's a skill that we've forgotten how to do as an adult, because we have a temptation sometimes to be already thinking ahead, think about what we are like to say. So we're not listening to everything, or we're not observing everything. So that tuning in is absolutely critical. And of course, this is often the case, particularly if you've got children speaking multiple languages. One of the joys of working in international schools is the amazing kind of range of languages that children bring into those arenas. In fact, a few weeks ago, I was really fortunate to work in a school in Bucharest, where all the children had arrived back from the start of the new term, and multiple languages, from Spanish, from Romanian, Mexican, we could hear, which kind of variation on Spanish. There were all kinds of things going on there. Italian, I think we could hear. But the way those children were able to kind of negotiate, they almost kind of created the language of childhood, I suppose, like a bit like Reggio Emilia, the 100 languages. They were able to form those relationships through tuning into each other. It was really, really interesting watching how skillful those children were as part of that process. And I've popped in together here a few slides just to give you some suggestions, reminders about kind of tuning in, giving full attention, that kind of showing that you understand. One of the key things in having a conversation with young children is part of it is they need to get that affirmation that you understand what it is they're saying. It's one thing that's actually quite hard when you're doing online training, where sometimes you can't see people's faces. So we don't know actually are the people understanding what we're saying. So it's great when sometimes we see someone smiling or nodding and think, yeah, actually, I get it, what it is you're saying. Respecting children's decisions, saying, yeah, I want to know a bit more about this. I'm really interested in what you've been talking about. Let's go on this discovery journey together. And then strategies like recapping. So just asking them to clarify their thinking. Sometimes reminding them, saying, oh, do you remember you said this might happen? Or do you remember we did this before? And then that checking in, is this what you really think? Okay, I just want to help me understand what it is that you're saying. So re-clarifying what the children might have been using as part of the conversation. Suggesting things, a great idea. We often, as adults, make really good suggestions to people, don't we? Based on our knowledge of them. So our friends will recommend a book or a film or a television program or a restaurant and so on, based on what they know about us. But we could also make a suggestion to children if, say, suddenly they're really interested perhaps in dinosaurs and we're saying, actually, should we go and have a look and see if there's a book in the dinosaur area? You might want to have a look at this, or you might want to try and solve a problem like this. I've tried to do it before, and I think this might be helpful. Again, that can link into that working partnership really, really strongly. The last one always makes me smile, where that idea of offering a different perspective and an alternative viewpoint. This idea that Goldilocks wasn't naughty when she ate the porridge. Well, having spent a lot of time with 4 and 5-year-olds and one of the exploring things like Goldilocks and the Three Bears, lots of 4 and 5-year-olds have a very clear view of just how naughty Goldilocks was and how she definitely shouldn't have broken into Three Bears' house. But always interesting, isn't it, to challenge perspectives and see what children think as part of that wider conversation. So other gains, some things that we need to make sure our adults have got. How have we got that understanding key vocabulary? School I visited a couple of days ago, actually, here in the UK, they'd spent a lot of time thinking about the key vocabulary for each area of provision. And it was thinking about how they could support their adults in developing almost a dictionary of provision and how those words are going to be used and introduced through interaction. We know that kind of just introducing a word once is never going to be effective. Children need to hear that word and to use that word within a meaningful context as well. And they'd spent a lot of time doing that. So some suggestions here to think about how our adults are working in different areas of provision, what kind of strategies are particularly effective, and spending as much time together as a team to be reflecting on what are really brilliant interactions. Some of you may be familiar with this. It's the Shrek approach, not the green monster from a film, which kind of disappointed me a bit when it first came out. This is a strategy that was shared from the Education Endowment Foundation. The Education Endowment Foundation is a website here in the UK, but I imagine you'll be able to really access it as well. Lots of resources on there as part of their early years toolkit, including the Shrek approach, which is a strategy to help support interactions in the early years. So if you haven't had a look at that, well worth diving in, having a look on the website. In fact, school I was talking to last Friday, they were saying it had a really big impact, particularly on staff who had less experience. It kind of provided a framework to support them with their interactions. And to go alongside the Shrek approach, there's also a YouTube video. So again, if you just go to YouTube Shrek approach early years, that will take you to it. But I've popped the link into the slides there for you as well. And last but not least, a little bit of early excellence news. I've mentioned there's lots of free resources you can access, and this is where you can find those on the Ideas and Inspiration tab. So you'll find the blogs and the podcasts, the audit tools, some free training videos and so on. And there's lots and lots of, in fact, there's a podcast every week. I know many of you have been listening to them, and it was lovely when we attended the BSME conference, how many people came up and said, oh, we've heard these podcasts or we've seen these webinars, already making those brilliant connections. So please do take a look at those. And if you'd be interested in taking part, please do let us know. We also have some videos called Inside Out, where we talk through different areas of provision and how to really make the most of those areas in terms of structuring them and the kind of way you might organize them, but also in terms of interaction as well. So you might find those helpful, particularly if you've got new members of the team. So you might have a little at those. And our planning guides. I know lots of you have now got our planning guides for the 3 to 5 version. Some of you may have our 5 to 7 version, and we now have a brand new 2 to 3 version as well. So you might find those helpful. Again, there's a link on the website there for you to have a look at as well. But something I'm really delighted to share with you, and you might have seen it in our newsletters, is members of the team, we're going to be at Guest Dubai in November. We've got a stand. We're going to be there as part of kind of the UK kind of pavilion area. We'll be there. So if you want to come along and say hello, we'd be absolutely delighted. If you want to book a meeting or conversation, again, drop me an email. We'd be really great to see you in person. And if there's things like you'd like the guides, maybe we can arrange a way if the guides being there available for you as well. So there's my email address. As I said, if there's anything after today that you'd like to know more information, please do drop me a line. If you're planning to go to Guest, please, again, do get in touch with us. But if there's anything else, we'd be delighted to hear from you. Thanks for watching. I said this really short webinar about interactions. We do lots more CPD here at Excellence, as I'm sure many of you are aware, and look forward to catching up with you all very, very soon. Take care. Bye-bye.